Hello and welcome to another edition of History Goes to the Movies. Today I want to talk about a movie that involves every historian's secret dream: time travel. That's right, today I'm talking about Back to the Future. This film is available now on Netflix. And what lover of history hasn't dreamed of hopping in a time machine, whether a phone box or a poorly conceived but cool-looking automobile, and going to see the past in person? We could finally discover if what we learned in school was really what the past was like. We could ask famous historical figures the questions we always wanted to ask them. We could kill Hitler. Of course, the idea of going back and changing the past is what leads us to the plot of Back to the Future, where Marty McFly accidentally travels from 1985 to 1955 and has to undo the damage he accidentally does to the timeline in order to make sure his parents get together at a high school dance so he can be born. Although, if his parents didn't get together because of his interference and he never was born, then who went back in time in the first place to stop them Okay, let's just not think about this too much. Of course, none of us are ever actually going to get a chance to go back in time. And fun fact, even if we did, we would very shortly die of epidemic diseases. Hopefully that's not too soon. Because we would encounter an entire raft of microscopic diseases that are slightly different than those that exist in the world today, and so we wouldn't have proper immunity to any of them. Basically, it would be War of the Worlds, except with us as the Martians. But I digress. I loved Back to the Future as a kid, and I think it sort of holds up as good popcorn entertainment today. But let's face it, from the perspective of history, it's, let's just say, problematic. In addition to a few anachronisms, such as someone calling Marty McFly a dork, a word that wasn't invented until the 1960s, there are some other issues with this film as well. And in fact, I would say that the film presents a version of the 1950s that's just as much about the 1980s as the actual 50s. Of course, perhaps it's unfair to talk about Back to the Future at all in terms of history, because it's not really intended to be a historical film. Rather, its approach to the past is one of nostalgia. Well, what's the difference? Nostalgia is a way of looking at the past that is fundamentally positive and sentimental. Nostalgia asks us to fondly remember a selective version of the past in which things were simpler, easier, and happier. It's similar to antiquarianism in that it seeks out those things that are most different between the past and the present day, delighting in these differences, and perhaps even exoticizing past times and places in order to contrast them with the present day. Now, history is no less selective an approach to the past, except its selective approach is to not necessarily remember just the good things, but to remember those events that have had the most impact on the present. History, quite simply, asks the central question, why? And explaining why things happened, it tries to explain why we are where we are today. Why is there conflict in the Middle East? Why did the Roman Empire fall? And as a result, far from overlooking the negative elements of the past, history is often accused of dwelling on them. Edward Gibbon famously said, "History is indeed little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind." Now, while I wouldn't go quite that far, I would say that historians tend to see the past as something that must be looked at, warts and all, because it's still a factor in our lives today. William Faulkner said that the past is never dead, it's not even past. So for historians, the past could never be a simpler, easier, happier time filled with fond memories, any more than the present day could be, because they are one and the same. History focuses as much upon continuity as it does on difference, making it very different than antiquarianism or nostalgia. And nostalgic approaches to the past, like Back to the Future, often say as much about the societies producing the nostalgia as they do about the time period being idealized. For example, Back to the Future is not really about the 1950s at all. It's about the idea of the 50s as it existed in the 80s. Many people have observed that nostalgia is a fad, and one that seems to have a pattern. 50s nostalgia originated in the 1970s with movies and TV shows like American Graffiti, Grease, and Happy Days. It reached its peak in the 1980s with movies like Back to the Future, Stand By Me, and TV shows like The Wonder Years. The 80s even saw a boom in 50s-style diners. But by the 1990s, the 50s moment seemed to have worn off. I remember growing up in the 90s at the height of 1960s nostalgia. The Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan were popular again. Jam bands like Phish and Dave Matthews Band took up the hippie baton handed to them by the Grateful Dead. Vietnam movies were seemingly everywhere, and Forrest Gump took us on a nostalgic trip through that decade of upheaval that became reduced to a series of stereotypes. Hippies, protesters, cool music. The grunge fashion of the 1990s echoed the hippie ethos of dressing down to upset the squares, and the decade even saw two ill-fated attempts to create that paragon of 1960s culture, Woodstock. It seems like every modern decade has produced its own nostalgia roughly 20 to 30 years later. The late 90s and early 2000s saw nostalgic movies set in the 70s. Dazed and Confused, Boogie Nights, not to mention Quentin Tarantino's extensive use of 70s music and culture in his early films. In this time period, bell-bottoms and disco momentarily became cool again. But by the end of the 2000s, and throughout the next decade, we had 1980s nostalgia breakout. Hot Tub Time Machine, Stranger Things, every homage to John Hughes movies that we see in teen shows today. And in our current moment, we are starting to see the birth of 90s nostalgia, with Rolling Stone magazine declaring 2018 the year of 90s nostalgia. Now, the weird thing about this industry is that, first, decades go from incredibly uncool to suddenly cool again almost overnight. I remember being a teen in the 1990s, and disco was the lamest thing possible. It couldn't be appreciated, even ironically. And just take a look at the pants. This was the height of cool in the 1990s. And a decade later, in the tight pants era, you wouldn't be caught dead wearing it. The recent revival of mum jeans shows that everything will eventually become cool again if you just wait long enough. Now, partially, this might just be part of some sort of hipster cycle. Hip people look for something that is so uncool that they can wear it ironically to show how cool they are, and then everyone else copies them, and before long it actually is cool again, so the true hipster has to find something else to do ironically. But why is this happening on a 20 to 30 year cycle? You might think the 30-year rule for nostalgia is a result of a now older generation looking back fondly on its youth, like the Duffer Brothers making Stranger Things. But what I find interesting is that, as in the case of Back to the Future, nostalgia products are not necessarily being marketed to the generation that lived through them, but the one that was born after and never experienced it. Back to the Future was a hit among the kids of the 80s. I remember seeing the first 90s retro night parties advertised on campus to my students in the 2010s, and they didn't remember the 90s. Now, while I was and still am nostalgic for the music, fashion, and generally cynical attitude towards life of that time period, I'm even more interested in why the students I teach today are so into this music that I listened to when I was 15 years old. What's going on? Now, perhaps this type of nostalgia isn't searching then for lost youth, but expressing a dissatisfaction with one's current world. Anyone who, like me, has had a feeling that they were born in the wrong era knows what I'm talking about. And for the record, growing up, I did wish I had been a teenager in the 60s. It's easy to see all the problems with your own time period and try to find one without those problems. We've always been tempted to create our own fantasy golden age in the past. In the movie Midnight in Paris, for example, Owen Wilson travels back in time to his romanticized golden age of the 1920s, only to find that the people living then think that the real golden age was the 1890s. This goes all the way back to the Renaissance, when northern Italians decided the Middle Ages were like super lame, but ancient Rome was cool. When we look back with a nostalgic gaze, we forget about the very real problems that each era possessed, and we see only the great things they had that we didn't. Which, of course, brings us back to the Future, and why the 50s were so big in the 80s. Now, for family values conservatives of the 1980s, the people who worked to elect Ronald Reagan, A supposed increase in drug use, divorce, teen pregnancy, abortion, and pornography were seen as signs of a society that had lost its way morally due to the decline of the nuclear family and organized religion. Conservatives alleged that this was a product of the social revolutions of the 60s, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, etc. So they looked for a time before these changes, when the nuclear family, with clearly defined gender roles, was the dominant form of social organization, and this led them to the 50s. Now, of course, this was a fantasy. The 50s were only a golden age for straight, white, middle-class men. Black Americans in the 50s faced segregation and systematic racism. Women were expected to give up careers in favor of marriage and children, and those in abusive relationships lacked the financial means to escape from them. Gays and lesbians faced persecution and arrest. Not to mention, this was all a time when the Cold War threat of nuclear holocaust loomed over daily life. So the entire mythology of the good 1950s, when everyone was happy and well off, was just that, a myth constructed by popular culture and latched onto by conservative Republicans to advance a particular political agenda. And this mythology works its way into Back to the Future, which portrays a white, affluent, wholesome small town full of fun-loving teenagers and hamburger joints with no bigger problems than who takes who to the school dance. There are no black characters of significance in Back to the Future except for the band at the dance, who in an insanely insulting twist learns to play rock and roll and tell Chuck Berry about it from a white teenager from the future, thus negating the hundreds of years of history of black music born out of resistance to oppression, from spirituals to the blues to rock and roll. When Ronald Reagan saw Back to the Future, he loved the movie, despite what perhaps remains the best joke in the film.
I'm telling the truth, Doc. You gotta believe me.
Then tell me, future boy, who's president of the United States in 1985?
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, the actor? Then who's vice president? Jerry Lewis?
I suppose Jane Wyman is a first lady.
Whoa, wait, Doc!
And Jack Benny is Secretary of the Treasury.
Doc, you gotta listen to me.
I got enough practical jokes for one evening. Good night, future boy.
No, wait, Doc!
Reagan actually loved this bit. And it makes sense that he would like the movie so much, since its vision of the 1950s conforms to the one being promoted at the time by Reagan Republicans, this idea of a lost innocence that America should seek to return to. However, Back to the Future doesn't entirely trade in pure nostalgia. In subtle ways, the film warns us against over-romanticizing the time in which our parents lived. In particular, the character of Biff and his bullying and attempted sexual assault of Marty's mother demonstrates that if we over-nostalgize the past, we risk forgetting that some pretty terrible things happened there as well. Marty gets to see his parents as they were. His father was not a fun-loving teenager, but an outcast loser. Finally, in the movie's craziest subplot, and one of the few times that incest is a plot point in a major Hollywood film, Marty's future mother becomes enamored with him and tries to act upon her attractions. From this subplot, we see the contradictions of 1950s sexual agency for women. Women like his mother face social sanction for even acting upon their sexual desires, but at the same time, they ran the constant risk of the sexual double standard, leaving them vulnerable to an entrenched rape culture perpetuated by entitled teenage boys like Biff. I mean, if you really think about it, Back to the Future deals with some really dark stuff. And I'm not just talking about the consequences of selling plutonium to Libyan terrorists. Now, by the end of the film, Marty is therefore happy to be back in his own time period, the 1980s. Now, this tells us that nostalgia can be a fun trip to take, but we wouldn't really want to live in a different time after all. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of History Goes to the Movies. And please join me next time when I revisit one of my favorite historical films of all time, also on Netflix, Lawrence of Arabia. And please make any requests for films you'd like to see me talk about in future episodes.